Audio Jungle. 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 Audio Jungle.
As the Japanese delegation stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, preparing to sign the documents that ended World War II, a large formation of Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers swooped low over Tokyo Bay as a reminder of the terrible destruction that had befallen their nation and turned Japan's cities into ruins. It was a reminder the Japanese really did not need the bombed-out rubble, and steadily smoking crematories around the country were evidence enough of the violent firestorm that had befallen the land of the rising sun. The national morale in Japan was so low that almost 70% of the people interviewed by U.S. military personnel after the surrender reported that they had reached the point where they were unable to endure one more day of war. Most Americans, especially the young soldiers and Marines who had been slated to invade the Japanese home islands of Kyushu and Honshu, believed that Japan surrendered because of the atomic bomb. They were wrong. In reality, the country had already been brought to its knees before the first atomic test at the Trinity site in the New Mexico desert 2 months before. Japan had been destroyed by fire from above, fire that had largely been delivered from the bomb bays of an armada of Boeing B-29s. The B-29 deployment, a political decision. The B-29 had come to symbolize American air power by September 1945 because of the role it played in the final defeat of Japan, but the large 4-engine bomber had originally been conceived as a weapon for use against Nazi Germany. The initial invitation for bid had been issued in the fall of 1940 as the War Department began preparing for a seemingly inevitable entrance into the war in Europe. Design problems and production delays kept the very long-range bomber out of service until it had become obvious that such range was no longer necessary against Germany. The first production B-29s began rolling off the assembly lines in mid-1943, prompting requests for the new bombers from commanders in each theater. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, the air commander in General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area of operations, was particularly insistent in his claims for the bombers. Not only had Kenney been shortchanged in aircraft and crews because of the high priority given to the European theater, but he had been heavily involved in B-29 development himself when he was in charge of Air Corps research and development at Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio, in 1941. Although Air Corps Commander General Henry H. Hap Arnold was receptive to Kenny's recommendations on use of the B-29s. The Southwest Pacific Air Commander wanted to use them from Australia, then from the Philippines. He had his own ideas as to where and how they should be deployed. Arnold was also prompted by his own ambitions. In spite of his high rank and responsibility, he had never seen combat or commanded men in battle. Now he saw an opportunity for his own combat command. Instead of assigning the B-29s to the overseas air forces, he decided to establish a new air force under his personal command, a strategic bombardment unit headquartered in Washington, D.C. The new 20th Air Force would be controlled by Arnold's own staff, which would select targets for the huge bombers and commanded the war from thousands of miles away. The ultimate decision on deployment of the B-29s was based largely on political considerations, including appeasing President Franklin D. Roosevelt's near obsession with mounting an aerial bombardment campaign against Japan at the earliest opportunity. The Liberal president was up for re-election to an unprecedented third term in 1944 and faced strong opposition from conservatives. The commencement of B-29 raids on Japan would boost his political stock. Early sustained bombing of Japan. In spite of their long range, there were only 4 places in the world close enough to Japan from which B-29s could operate, and one of those, Soviet Siberia, was off limits because of Soviet neutrality in the war with Japan. Bases in the Aleutians were in range of Japan, but the horrific subarctic weather presented problems for the untried bombers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff saw potential for establishing B-29 bases in the Mariana Islands, a concept that pleased Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, because such a move increased the importance of the Pacific Ocean Area of Operations, the only area under U.S. Navy command. King also favored Arnold's plan for an independent command, as it would keep the B-29s away from Douglas MacArthur. The third option was establishing B-29 advance bases in China, an option that would allow attacks on Japan to commence several months before bases could be established on the island of Saipan in the Marianas, and this was the option Arnold chose. Operations from China were also seen as a means of improving the morale of the Chinese people, who had been fighting the Japanese since 1931. To command the first B-29s, Arnold selected Brigadier Kenneth B. Wolfe, an ideal choice since he was the project officer for the entire program and was intimately familiar with the airplane. Wolfe established the 58th Bombardment Wing, H, at Marietta, Georgia, where B-29s were being produced, then began training crews at Salina, Kansas. He drew up plans for operations from China called Early Sustained Bombing of Japan and given the codename Matterhorn. The Matterhorn plan called for the B-29s to be based in the vicinity of Calcutta, India, with forward operating bases established around Chengdu, China. It was an ambitious plan, particularly in terms of logistics, since all military operations in China were solely dependent on air transportation for supply. Although there was an established airlift operation from India to China conducted by the Air Transport Command, Wolfe proposed that XX Bomber Command, the organization he would take to India, be entirely self-sufficient. The XX Bomber Command would include its own air transportation group equipped with older consolidated B-24 Liberators that had been converted into C-87 transports and C-109 tankers. The B-29s would also be used as transports, and after they arrived in India several were converted into tankers to haul gasoline. In an effort to maintain a degree of secrecy, the War Department took advantage of the B-29 development programs and put out a story that the planes had proven unsuccessful as bombers and were being converted into armed transports for duty in the China-Burma-India theater. It is unlikely that the Japanese bought the story. Synchronous bombing. Saunders planned another attack on Manchuria, but before it was flown Maj. General Curtis LeMay arrived to take over XX Bomber Command. The mission was flown as planned, with LeMay going along to observe his crews in action. The attack resulted in considerable damage to the Showa Steel Works, but LeMay decided to institute new policies, including changing the basic formation from 4 planes to 12 to get a wider bombing pattern and consolidating the force into fewer groups with larger squadrons in a move to reduce support personnel and improve maintenance. He also instituted a new policy of synchronous bombing, with one bombardier staying on radar while the others attempted to acquire the target visually. In spite of LeMay's new policies, Matterhorn's days were numbered. The XX Bomber Command only flew one more mission against a steel target, an attack on the shoal works that produced absolutely no damage at all. Future missions were directed against Japanese aircraft industry targets and airfields on Formosa. Mining of rivers and harbors became a B-29 responsibility. In December, XX Bomber Command flew a mission that Chennault later claimed as a turning point. Since June, he had been pressing for a B-29 attack on the Japanese supply depot at Hongkou with incendiary bombs but had been ignored by XX Bomber Command leadership. After Japanese forces in China went on the offensive and threatened the Allied bases, Chennault renewed his efforts. He was supported by the new commander in China, Lieutenant Albert C. Wedemeyer. LeMay questioned Wedemeyer's authority since he only commanded in China and the B-29s were in India, but Arnold agreed to the mission since he really had no other choice in view of the military situation in the region. Incendiary bombs on Hongkou. The attack on Hongkou was not the first B-29 incendiary attack of the war. Arnold had ordered experimental incendiary attacks from Saipan in November 1944, and a mission on the night of November 29 against Tokyo had met with little success. The Hongkou attack was successful beyond expectations. 84 B-29s were part of a more than 200-plane mission on December 18. In spite of the initial formation dropping its bombs upwind, damage to the docks and warehouses was tremendous. Intelligence estimated that 40 to 50% of the target had been destroyed by 38% of the bombs. Chennault reported that Hongkou had been rendered useless as a military base. B-29 success rises. Once combat operations against Japan commenced, Hansell and O'Donnell lost their authority for mission planning to 20th Air Force in Washington. The first target directive was the destruction of the Japanese aircraft industry, with XX Bomber Command continuing the campaign it had commenced whilst XI struck targets out of range of B-29s operating from China. The city of Tokyo itself was not on the list of primary targets, although aircraft factories in outlying areas were. For propaganda effect at home, 20th Air Force chose to fly the first mission against the Nakajima Hikoki plant at Mushishino, a Tokyo suburb, which was the number 2 target on the priority list. The plant was believed to produce more than 30% of all Japanese combat aircraft engines, but the main reason it was chosen was so that headlines would read "Tokyo bombed." The attack was to be carried out in daylight using precision bombing methods.
Audio Jungle. 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 Audio Audio Jungle.